Bill here, Featherweight Guy. You may recall from the video I posted a little while back about prepping for paint. This is that machine. When you saw it in the last video, it was bare aluminum. I actually recorded some video in between when I had primer on it and then the first coat, but it was not good enough video, and I've since put some paint on here, and I can't really go back and repeat those processes without stripping it, which I'm not going to do. But I wanted to show you what I do between coats. So this has now got, it's got its second coat of color on here. I primed it with that self-etching primer, and then I put a very light first coat on, and I wet sanded, and I've now applied the second coat, and I'm going to wet sand again. So let me talk to you about wet sanding, because what we're doing with wet sanding is really important for getting a very smooth finish. When you apply spray paint, and I'm using aerosol, I mean, I'm painting with this, it's an automotive acrylic lacquer, or excuse me, automotive acrylic enamel. There are also lacquers, but this is enamel. And when you spray, whether out of a rattle can or with spray equipment, and I have spray equipment too, I could set up a spray gun, but it's hardly worth the bother for something this small. The work of setting up and then cleaning the gun afterwards, just kind of a pain in the butt. So I'm just as happy to use the aerosol cans. But what I was going to say is the finish that you get has a kind of a orange peel surface to it. So if you take it and look in the light at an angle, you can kind of see that textured surface. And I don't really like that. That's not the finish I'm going for. I want a very smooth finish, and you get that through wet sanding. And so let's talk about that. You use special paper. This is paper that's made for wet sanding. It's got a different kind of a paper that doesn't get soggy when it's wet, and pretty fine grits. This is as coarse as I'm going to use. This is 600 grit. I've got paper up through 3000 grit, but really I hardly ever use that really fine stuff. So what I'm going to do here is show you how I wet sand, but let's talk about the tools here. So in addition to the paper, it's really important to use sanding blocks and sanding pads when you're sanding. If you simply take the paper and fold it up and sand with your fingers, what happens is where your fingertips are is the only places that you're really applying sanding, and the other places don't get sanding. So you get a very uneven sanding job. So that's not the way to do it. You really need, this is a hard rubber block. It does have some flex to it if I press really hard, but it's actually quite stiff rubber. And so for all the flat surfaces like the bed and the bed extension, I will use the rubber block with the sandpaper wrapped around it and water, and I'll be showing you that in just a minute. But for anything that's not flat, so any of these curved areas, I use a different kind of a block. This is it's a very flexible closed cell foam sanding pad, and these you buy wherever auto body supplies are sold. This is what you use when you're wet sanding a car, and I use them also on furniture. But it's nice and flexible, but you can wrap the paper around it and it'll follow the contours of what you're sanding and spread that sanding pressure out evenly, so you get a smooth sanding job. So it's important to use the right tools. Also, of course, we need water. I'm working here at the sink, so I can get water, I can rinse and everything, and a damp sponge, because you're going to want to wipe off and see the progress you're making. And as you're sanding, if it's getting a little dry, you can squeeze the sponge and add a little water to the slurry. The water carries the grit away that you're sanding. If you dry sand, the stuff accumulates under the paper, but wet sanding, it lubricates it, it keeps it smooth, and the slurry carries the debris out from under the sanding paper, so you get a better job when you wet sand that way. So I'm gonna reset the camera closer so we can get a good look at this, and I'm gonna show you how I wet sand. Okay, so I'm gonna start on the bed here, and I'm gonna take my paper and wrap it around this hard rubber block, and I'm just gonna dip it in my little bowl of water here to get it wet. And I'm going very lightly here. The idea is not to be bearing down much. We're knocking off the high spots in the paint. And one thing when you're wet sanding is the edges. It's very easy to sand through at the edges. So anywhere I'm near any kind of edge, or the edge around the needle plate opening, this edge, you don't want to be applying any pressure near the edge because you'll sand through the paint. And then that will create a problem that we got to, you know, do additional coats of paint to make sure we built up enough finish at the edges. So easy does it on the wet sanding. Especially between coats. I'm not really trying to remove a lot. I'm just leveling the surface here. And you can see it's not taking a lot. We can go in kind of a circular motion. You want to, you know, cover everything. You don't really need to go crazy here. It's not like the whole surface is rough. Okay? And then I'm going to take my sponge and rinse it out and squeeze it out. So I've now taken off that slurry, and I can see that I'm doing very well. You can kind of see the surface will look shinier where you haven't, where the sanding paper hasn't touched. You'll see shinier areas. So like back in here, it's shiny because I didn't really get back in there very well, but the rest of this is nice and smooth. And I don't need to go any further than that. That's just fine. So I'm going to turn this around to this edge. Get a little more water on here, and I'm gonna wet sand all through in here. And again, I'm being very careful. I'm trying to favor, like when I go along this edge, I'm trying to keep the pressure on the inside so the block is really only very lightly touching the edge. Same thing as I go around the needle plate opening, and we just want to really even this up so that the next coat of paint is laying down on a very smooth surface. And successive coats that you apply this way over a very smoothly prepared flat surface are going to level out better. As the paint, when the paint is wet and it hits the surface, it starts to flow out and level out. And you can imagine, you know, if you magnified that kind of orange peely textured surface, the paint is going to conform to that. And so by having a level surface, a nice smooth level surface, we're going to get a better job. All right, so that's probably as much as I need to do on that bed surface. Again, I'm not gonna try to sand every nook and cranny on here. I'm really just going over the areas that are most visible and that you know, are going to be most noticeable, you know, or the places where you're going to be touching. Tactile is really important because you're very sensitive. Your fingertips are very sensitive to imperfections. You know, you can often trust your fingertips if you want to feel, and if you feel a rough spot, it's going to telegraph through the finish. So I'm gonna go very lightly up in these areas here. We're just gonna kind of take off any little imperfections here. We don't need to be aggressive, especially as we work our way up through more and more coats. Easy does it. We're just being, it's kind of like de-prickling it, if you want to think of it that way. So that's the process. I'm gonna not finish this whole thing in front of you here. I'm just, hopefully you can see. I don't know how well it shows up on the camera, but that's now, when I look at that, it's uniformly dull. I can see there's a tiny little spot there that must have been a little bit high that has come back down. So that's exactly right. And I haven't sanded through, so I don't have any bare aluminum showing. That's great. So I'm just going to continue. I'm going to work my way gently around this machine. I'll use the hard rubber block on this edge here and on the back. And I'll use the flexible foam for these contoured areas. And that'll be it. Then I'll carefully wipe it down with the sponge, and I'll set it aside to dry for a couple hours. My wife and I are heading out tonight, so that's fine. Tomorrow I will, it'll be dry. I'll wipe it down again, and I'll take cotton swabs, you know, these kind of swabs on the stick to get any of the sanding residue out of the little corners here and there. And then I will wipe it down with a tack rag to pick up any dust, and then it'll be ready for another coat of finish. Excuse me. So that's the process. I was using 600 grit paper today. the next coat will be coat number 3. I'm thinking it's going to take 4 coats to get what I want here. So after coat number 3, I'll probably be sanding with 800 or 1000, something like that, just lightly, just to keep it nice and level and smooth before I put that last coat of black on. And after the last coat of black, I will apply the decals. I don't sand before I put the decals on because the sanding dulls the surface, and that dull area will look different under the decal. So you gotta apply the decal to an unsanded surface, and then I will very lightly sand with probably 1500 paper, but not. I'll be careful to avoid the decals. I'll come up close to them, but I'll avoid the decals. So I'm leveling out any imperfections in the other areas before I start applying the clear coat, which is I'll probably do 2 of the clear, and I can wet sand after that first coat of clear is on, again with probably 1500, and then the last coat of clear, and then it should really be a quite nice finish. So that's the process. I'll come back later, probably after all the color is on and I'm ready for decals, and I'll show you what I do there and get it ready for the clear coat, and then I'll show you how it looks with the clear. So this will hopefully inspire you to, if you're going to want to take one of these projects on, just to kind of know what you're in for. Kind of a lot to it if you want to get a really nice quality job. It takes some practice. It also takes a little practice applying the paint. It's very easy to put too much paint on and get a run or a drip or a sag. And there's a lot of nooks and crannies that you got to turn and work at angles and, kind of get down low and tip the piece so that you can get the paint into all the nooks and crannies here, especially the early coats. The later coats, I don't need to be as crazy about getting paint all in underneath here. That's well painted now, and that probably doesn't need much more. So most of the last couple of coats is concentrating on these highly visible top surfaces. All right, it's the next day, and I'm getting ready to put coat number 3 on this 1936 Featherweight, but I wanted to show you, I finished wet sanding after I shot the video yesterday, and I wanted to show you what it looks like so you can see where, we've kind of smoothed it out, but haven't removed a lot of material. Down here on the bed, I sanded a little more heavily. You can see how that makes it nice and smooth, but I've been careful, around the edges not to go in too deep. There's the front and so forth. So that's what it's going to look like, after you've wiped it down and it's dry. This is kind of what to expect. Here's the bed extension here. And you can see if I tip it a little bit here. It's kind of interesting. There's a few spots. You see a couple of spots here. And those actually correspond to where the ribs are in the casting. So those are little dimples that are actually in the aluminum from the casting. And we're not going to worry about that. They're very shallow. But what you see is when you're wet sanding, it stays shiny where the paper doesn't touch. So the paper didn't reach the bottom of the divot. And so you end up with a spot there. That may still telegraph through, but that's fine. When you can't make this absolutely perfect. You have to work with what's there. Likewise on the side, you see the area in the middle there. Again, that's in the casting. That's a shallower spot in the casting. And you see the same thing on this side, and it corresponds with where the ribs join. So that's just, that's the nature of the beast. And here's our light. It's ready for a top coat, and the top cap with the spool pin. So I'm gonna set up to paint. I wanted to show you what I do here. This is, by the way, the carbon filter mask that I wear. I'll put that on. I don't have a proper spray booth or anything, and I don't have a fan in here. And actually, I don't have a fan on purpose, because when you're spraying, the vapors are flammable, and a proper spray booth fan is very expensive. It's a special enclosed motor that makes no spark. If you just buy a cheap box fan, or the kind of fan you might find anywhere, consumer level, those motors generate a spark inside as they're spinning, and that spark can ignite the vapors under the right circumstances. So I'm not going to risk blowing up my house just to keep the air moving. So instead, I mean, I'm spraying a very small quantity out of a rattle can. So I'm wearing a mask, and that's my way of dealing with the airborne particles. So, all right, so that's it for now. I'll show you again after I have a coat of paint on here, and getting ready for hopefully what will be, I hope, the final coat. This is coat number 3. I'm expecting to do this in 4 coats. All right.